wherever you're joining us from. This is our Tuesday live stream, and we are joined by our partners over at Avèro Consulting or Avèro Advisors. And we're excited to talk about our topic today, that is public versus private sector in digital transformation. Definitely some exciting nuances, and our experts and guests today, our experts they're experts in the specifically the public sector. So just a few logistics before we get started. As always, we can see your comments, questions. We always love hearing from our audience as we go through here. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and pop them in the chat wherever you are joining us from today. Just to test that feature, we'd love to hear from our global audience. If you could just pop in where you're located and where you're joining us from today, we'd love to know that. So with that, let's jump into this very exciting conversation. I'm personally very excited for it because I think Eric has met his digital twin, if you will, in the market. So I'm definitely excited to hear from Avèro and the AV team too. So with that, we're going to have Megan help us facilitate on the public side, and we will do more of the private side questions and dig into the difference with those from Eric. So although most of you already know Eric, we will have him do just a quick introduction and maybe talk a little bit about more of the private sector, although we do at Third Stage do some in the public sector as well. But kind of talk about your overall experience with that, Eric, and do just a quick intro, and then we'll pass it to Megan and AV.
Sure. So thanks for hosting this, first of all. And my name is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys, both in the public and private sector, but mainly the private sector. Most of our clients are public or private sector related clients, manufacturing, construction, financial services, professional services, etc. I've been doing this for about 25 years in the ERP and digital transformation space. So really look forward to chatting through the nuances of what the differences and similarities are in some of the private sector work that we've done, as well as some of the more public sector work that AV has done.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, excited always to have Eric on. But with that, I'd love to hear from the Avèro team. Megan, pass it over to you, and you guys can do some introductions, kind of tell us where you work in the digital transformation space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for having us on today. I'm Megan Seaton. I'm the business development manager for Avèro. Part of my job is to brand build and share the story. So this is a great opportunity for us to do so. At Avèro, we help carve the path to modernization for local cities and counties. So we focus more in the public sector space. And today, obviously, I have our founder and CEO, AV. And AV, if you want to do your own introduction, I'll turn it over to you.
Great job introducing me. I feel like a star on the show.
You are a star.
No, that's it. But anyway, my name is AV Verekar. I just go by AV, and I'm 6 years ago to focus on digital transformation and ERP in the public sector into the 21st century. So when we do IT strategic planning or transformations, we're bringing our clients from the 1970s, 80s, still have green screens and AS400s and extremely broken process at the time, 20 years ago, were cutting edge, but our clients tend to be built. We saw a niche in that industry, and our focus has been anything to do with public sector, cities, counties, states, utilities, school systems, these public housing agencies, anything government, we help them modernize business practices through business process redesign, mapping, and logical enhancements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're coming in and out a little bit, and sometimes that happens with the live stream, AV. So sometimes we can pop you back out and pop you back in, because we definitely want to hear everything that you're saying in that piece. And it sounds like, just building on what those ideas are, that there are quite a bit of different nuances when it comes to a public versus private digital transformation. So let's dive into that. So let's start with you, Eric, while we kind of work on the AV audio situation.
How's this?
What are some? Yeah, so we can hear you a little bit better now. So
Okay.
let's talk about what are some reasons in which a public versus private digital transformation takes place. It sounds like in the public sector, there might be a very large urgency or a need to be able to do that. A little bit different than needing something in the private sector, like a competitive advantage or an organizational need. So, Eric, Kassan, let's start with you on that and kind of talk about the differences that you've seen throughout your career and those two different categories.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that, if I start with the private sector and then turn it over to AV for the public sector priorities, in the private sector, it's usually profit driven, efficiency driven, competitive advantage driven. I think there are, in terms of the business value that organizations get in the private sector, I suspect that's quite a bit different, and my impression is that's quite a bit different. I think there's some similarities though too, for sure. Like AV mentioned that, a lot of his modernization work that he does at Avèro is focused on organizations that are still, stuck in the 70s or 80s using mainframe, green screen sorts of systems. I think that's somewhat true in the private sector as well. You get just really outdated systems in the private sector at times, and then other times it's just more, they're on a 10 or 20-year-old system. So I think my impression is that the private sector might be a little bit ahead of the public sector in terms of technological maturity and where they're starting from. But I'm curious to see what you think, AV, in terms of where the public sector is different in that regard.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Is this okay, Kyler? Good.
Yeah, you're still coming in a little bit choppy, but I think we're getting what you're saying. Let's go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the trigger is no profit motive for our clients, and there is a always to be more efficient, be more transparent, be more with the time. The funding doesn't exist a lot of times, or because no one's asked for the funding. Times there's a negative inertia, so to speak. Like your things are working at a very basic level, so why change? So the trigger points tend to be there's a new mayor in town, there's a new administrator, there's a new schools director been elected. They've ran on this platform of becoming more efficient and becoming more transparent. They come in and sort of trigger point a change process. So it's not always profit, and they'll talk about saving money and being more advances, but that also doesn't tend to be the highest motivator. It's more often than external change that's mandated, that some regulations telling them to things break and there's a cyber attack, or that they're back to doing stuff on them. But really, there is no profit motive in our clientele.
That's interesting in that piece of it, and understanding that a lot of organizational pieces that you just mentioned, AV, are big factors as well. Thinking about new public administrators or those types of things. So let's talk about that a little bit and kind of dig into that. And I know, Megan, you have some questions too. So I promise, as the audience knows, I won't do all the talking. But when we look at things like organizational change and how those fit specifically, we know that that's huge on our side. Number one reason of failure when it comes to digital transformation. How is that different on the public side? So let's go directly to you, AV. Is that a huge factor that you need to be aware of when it comes to organizational design or organizational factors when you're talking about bureaucracy and constituents and those different factors?
The points of failure tend to be on the organizational side. It's lack of preparation, lack of an understanding of what you're looking for from the. It's easy to just dismiss this as buying new computers or servers or getting a new system, but I'm sure this is a commonality between the public and private sectors where if you have a digital transformation process through and what the outcomes need to be and how your organizational what's required, then that can really cause a failure. More often than not, as organization, it's not paying attention to how important project management it is to set a global vision for what this project.
That's really interesting. And Eric, if you can build on that, that would be helpful. And I know we're still having some audio problems, so thank you for letting us know in the comments. We'll continue to kind of troubleshoot that in a live, very non-stressful environment. So, so just hang out with us for a little bit as usual. If you have questions, go ahead and pop those in there. I'm going to get to some of what Basan's saying about kind of innovation and digital transformation here in a second, but I want to give Erica a chance to kind of talk to what that looks like from a public and private, just in your experience as well.
Yeah, so I think there's, you have, internal organizational dynamics. I totally agree with AV that's, I think, a universal problem or opportunity for both public and private sector transformations.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in the, in the private sector, you have, I guess, just different political drivers. It's more, I feel like in the private sector, the political drivers internally that could undermine potentially a transformation is going to be, people jockeying for, position or authority or jockeying for, moving up the organization. And generally speaking, the larger the organization, the more politics you're going to have, and the more complicated it gets in terms of those internal dynamics. So I'm not sure if the drivers or the causes of those internal politics and those internal organizational issues are different in the public sector, but certainly in the private sector, that's something that, a more established, larger, more mature organization is generally going to have just more complexity in terms of the internal dynamics, the internal politics, the resistance to change, the highly tenured workforce, all that stuff. So there's probably, I would imagine, just more variety, I guess you'd say, in terms of what sorts of dynamics you see in the private sector, just because there's so many different sizes of organizations and that sort of thing. But be curious to see what you think, AV.
Yeah, and is this better?
Yeah,
Sorry,
actually, it is.
It is? Okay, good. Thank you. The driver point of difference in the drivers and what tends to sort of pull the boat forward is IT, right? The CIOs tend to be more interested in change in the private sector, I think. In our case, the CIOs are interested in keeping things conservative, more secure, and then is that if you don't change, then you're more secure. If you don't change, then things working at a very basic baseline, and we don't want to shake the boat too much. The CIOs don't tend to be, even if they are forward thinking, they don't want to take the creating a political storm by wanting to change systems frequently or introducing change. But I think from talking to you, Eric, it seems like you guys market to have a solid partner in the IT organization where we're dealing with the elected officials and top management that will tell the CIOs in the IT organization what needs to happen.
Do you feel like, I'm just curious, AV, do you feel like in the public sector that people feel more secure in their jobs and their tenure to the point where they can do things that might undermine a project and it's not going to have the same consequences as if you're at a private sector organization? Or what are your thoughts on that?
It's really hard to you hear me? It's really hard to fire somebody in the public sector. They might the worst consequence they might get is they get put on leave, but that's also it's not things right and do things as well the first time. So the more progressives that can easily be fired. So
right.
There's always that, right? But then it also things better if they have a professional team like ours come in, just take on and manage the vendor, manage
Yeah. Sorry, I think we're lagging here, AV, which is why we're all staring at you awkwardly when you stop talking. But if you want to try and yeah, no worries. That's why we have our IT support team working behind the scenes. I'm just kidding. There is no IT support team. We wish we had one of those. But let's turn to our audience real quick. We always have a global audience, and just a reminder, what happens with this live stream. Is it goes into our Ground Control podcast, which is our longer form podcast, which streams and is available new episodes every Wednesday. So this will be in the following Wednesday's episode. And AV and Eric actually did a video shoot as well at the Avèro offices in Tennessee here in the States. So we will be including those with some other stakeholders as well in that episode. So be sure to subscribe to our Ground Control podcast, and you can, be notified when that happens. So I want to turn to the audience real quick, and Megan, again, I'd love to get your feedback on this too. So let's talk about where we have our audience joining us from today. So we have Mexico, Ryan from Denver, Colorado. We have James in the UK, Malcolm in the UK. We have I'm terrible with names, so I'm so sorry if I butcher it, but it's Louis from Cape Town as well, and Germany. So we have a lot of different global audiences here. So I want to pull up real quick as my dog Ghassan's question here, and maybe Megan, you can take this for me from a vendor's perspective and talk about kind of innovation when it comes to product functionality.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I'm going to turn that one over to AV. I know he's very choppy, but I think this is a niche of his, and I'm going to let him answer that if you don't care.
Can you? I want to make sure you guys can hear me. Okay, am I audible?
Yep, you're good for right now.
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Sorry. And yes, we don't have IT support this morning right before the live stream. Our systems went down, so
Yes.
apologies. This is a great case for the topic we're on. So from a vendor's perspective, when a software vendor is listed in stock exchange, innovation is hindered. Case in point, Epicor many years ago. Yeah, so I'm not sure about Epicor, but we have other publicly traded software vendors that the pressure for them is to make the stock price go up. The pressure is to have solid financials every quarter. And I think what we've seen is they have lagged behind in terms of customer service and the quality of the product. And you can easily blame that on being a publicly traded company, but I don't know if that's a generalization we can make. There's just one company that I can think of that I won't name, obviously, that we've seen falter really bad because their focus has been on acquisitions and growth through acquisitions and growth through acquiring new clients. And unfortunately, we see that a lot, right? We do a lot of RFP reviews for our clients because we're independent, we're third party, just like Third Stage, and our clients are government sector clients, so they have to release RFPs when they need to buy a new product. They can't just go and buy something. So we are looking at proposals. There's a county up in New York. We recently helped through the RFP process. 10 different proposals came in, and the largest of these vendors, who's very prominent in the public sector, their proposal had some other clients' names in it, right? And it didn't even pertain to what this client was asking about. They just like copied and pasted it. And for a publicly traded company, that's a very bad look. And it's indicative of how badly that one vendor is treating their clients. So yeah, it's not always great that they're publicly traded, because we've seen that isn't always an advantage.
Yes, and on that same topic, I feel like here most recently we've seen, not to bash any vendors, right? But timelines, right? They come in and they say, we want to implement this software in 6 months, and it's like, what? Can you speak on that a little bit, AV? Maybe provide some examples on timelines and why that's a bad idea.
Yeah, and I think that's a commonality too between our practice and Third Stage, is where the vendor community is, especially in ours, they're counting on our clients to not push back and ask the questions. They're counting on our clients being sort of less educated in the whole process of digital transformations and ERP implementations. So they'll throw things out to see what sticks. For example, a good example is how much to, how long is it going to take to implement a tax collection system? And a very common answer is, oh yeah, we can do it in 6 months, without asking the follow-up questions of, what the nuances of your operations are, how many agencies are involved. The salespeople are incentivized to uh, get the signature on the dotted line, and then they disappear and leave it to the project management team to solve, who then coming and say, yeah, that's not possible, and what was sold to you isn't what we typically do. So there's a huge disconnect, and I don't know, what are you seeing similar things on your side, Eric?
Yeah, we are, and it's that timeline's a big deal, as far as being realistic about it. I think in today's agile environment, and in today's you know focus on speed, and just trying to counter, because I think what happens in the industry is the ERP and digital transformation space is notorious for projects taking too long, costing too much money, being failures, all that stuff. So the industry has responded by saying, okay, well, let's do things that are more agile. Let's take an agile approach. So they'll come in and say, hey, we can do this in 6 months. We could roll out the technology in 6 months. We'll take this agile approach. We'll do sprints, all that stuff. And not that there's anything wrong with agile, but what it does, it creates a false impression or a false expectation that just by being agile and by leveraging agile concepts, now we're going to be able to deploy, we're going to be able to go through our transformation faster. But the problem is not the technology deployment that slows down a transformation. It's all the stuff that you were talking about, Evie, the organizational stuff, the operational stuff. And Agile doesn't really fix that. If anything, Agile in some ways undermines that need to focus on improving processes and defining your future state and all that stuff. So I think that's a common challenge. I would think across both public and private sector.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing on our side is they're not even calling it agile. It's just a way for them to push the risk on the client and get sign-offs on things that don't make sense. And when we are in the mix and we get called in to review the plans and shepherd a client through an implementation process, we're called hostile because we're asking very basic questions of the vendor's project management team. Where is the project plan? How do you expect us to go live on a randomly picked day? And that's when you can tell that they're used to treating the clients in a certain way. And when a professional team is involved, like ours or yours, when we start asking questions, that makes our vendor friends really uncomfortable. So I wish they would use terms like agile to at least put a veneer of we've thought this through
Right.
before they put stuff out there, but they don't. Sounds like they
Yeah.
do on your side.
Yeah, they do. I think that it's such a buzzy word, to say, look, we're
Yeah.
going to take an agile approach, and people think, oh, okay, agile, that sounds good. So you're going to solve the problem of projects taking too long, being complicated, and all that stuff.
Right.
Absolutely. And speaking of agile, a lot of times and those timelines and dedicating overall commitment to those, there's a lot of risk there, right? There's a lot of risk associated with transformation failure. So I want Megan and AV, and we'll go to you, Eric, after. If you can kind of take us through what are some specific risks that are maybe more prevalent in the private sector or that you've seen with your project work?
So the most prevalent is a political risk, right? We're depending on who we're working with. Let's say we're working with a county in rural Tennessee. You have to convince, I don't know, 20 plus county commissioners in a small county that a certain transformation effort is necessary. Now, go back to our initial thought on who is our main point of contact, right? You can convince the CIO, you convince the CFO, you convince the mayor, and now they have to present this to this legislative body, and you have to get buy-in from them. And that buy-in isn't constant because they're elected for 4 years, and some of these projects take 4 to 6 years. And now you have your support system that gets elected out of the office, and is your project still going to be a go? That's like a macro risk. But at a project level, it really tends to be the speed at which we can move, right? And in the private sector, again, you have profit motives. You have to meet your goals for production. Your inventory controls need to be tightened up. There's a real dollar amount that can be assigned to not having this project complete on time. On our side, it's more esoteric. It's more political. It's what are we going to be in the news? What is the press going to say about this? Who's going to vote for me if I have this public failure? So a lot of times failures tend to be glossed over, and you sort of have a longer rope, so to speak, for failed project, which isn't necessarily good, right? Because you
Yeah.
can just stick with bad processes, bad systems, just because you don't want to look bad. Um, so those are some common themes and risks that we see.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
perception obviously is on a heightened level. So what about you, Eric? What are some risks that you feel like are a little bit different in the public versus private sector?
well, I think it's super interesting to hear the you
Yeah.
know the what AV just said, because that's
Mhm.
fascinating. That taking the safer route sometimes might be the temptation in the public sector, because
Yeah.
you're not risking as much. You don't risk having a failure. Although like in the United States, we had just, I think it was last week, the FAA,
Mhm.
the Federal Aviation, what does the other A stand for? I forgot what FAA
Authority,
stands
You should,
agency.
yeah,
for.
Yeah.
yeah.
Leave it to the
There
private
you go.
sector, or leave it to the public sector
Mhm.
folks here to help me out on this. But but the FAA in the United States, which regulates air traffic in the United States, they had a system outage. And
Yep.
Southwest Airlines in the United States had a system outage, although that's not a
Mhm.
public sector entity. I think it's a good reminder that there's risk to not modernizing your systems and
Mhm.
leaving things the way they are. It may seem like it's lower risk on the surface,
Yeah.
but I think we're seeing in recent weeks a couple case studies in the public sector and transportation related industry
Yeah.
where what those risks are. Um, and I think that's true in the private sector too. But I would say that the private sector is probably a little bit more likely to have made some more incremental upgrades over the years. They're probably a little bit further ahead than the public sector. So in some ways, it makes it, I don't want to say it makes it easier, but the more incremental improvements that have happened over the years, presumably, if I'm correct, that it happens more often in the public sector, generally speaking, then the transformations aren't as big of a leap for them. Whereas, if you're in the public sector or any organization that's using, say, a mainframe-based system from the 70s, jumping from that to like a full cloud-based SaaS solution, ERP sort of solution, that's just a big jump. And so there's more organizational risk and more pain that goes along
Yeah.
with that. So I don't want to say it's easier in the private sector, but in some ways, maybe it is. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe.
Yeah. Our clients, if they don't change very often, so they have the advantage perceivably of leapfrogging bad technology, right? A lot of our clients, like our hometown client here, is we took them from an AS400 to a cloud-based ERP system over 2.5 years. But for that to happen, they had to overhaul their ISPs. They had to overhaul their network environment. They had to overhaul internal processes for backups and security. You can't just go, because it wasn't just an isolated ERP that was old. Everything was old, and they
Mm.
hadn't changed at all. So the advantage of that was they could leapfrog bad ERP practices. Like, 15 years ago, you would have built something from scratch, an army of engineers in their data centers building it for you. They could go from an AS400 to cloud-based SaaS ERP system, um, because that's what they could afford in terms of monetary value and business processes. Their IT staff had been around since, again, the 1970s, and hadn't kept up with the times. And they were retiring. So it wasn't just the system that was being changed. It was the entire organization and way they thought about technology that was being changed. So leapfrogging bad technologies is an advantage, but at the same time, they hadn't done anything incremental. So they had to really like burn everything to the ground and start over. But yeah, we have some clients that have done certain things. They've kept up to speed with security systems and emails and things, but a majority of the systems are still at least in the 1990s.
Mm.
I love the question that just came through the chat, because I think this is a huge topic when we're talking
Mhm.
about end user training and people's jobs. They feel like their jobs are on the line, right? When we go through this digital transformation. So the question is, how often do you find during testing or implementation that the skills gap is bigger than initially thought? And employees need to be repositioned within the company or replaced. So whoever wants to take that question, I think it's probably very similar in both.
And I think it's similar and different. I think, and I'm going to take a stab at Eric's world. I think when you have a newer system that's bringing more automation and efficiencies, private sector clients may lay off and reduce headcount because it's cost saving. It's direct impact on the bottom line. In our world, we've seen clients become more efficient in the sense that a really smart accountant who was doing data entry and triplicating and copying and pasting things into 3 different spreadsheets can now become more of a report analytics, forward-thinking strategic person. So we've seen those shifts happen where a client or a small city has been able to really take advantage of the staffing that they have to make things more strategically important. And then if people are retiring their only purpose for not retiring was that they were the only people that knew, like Ghassan said, RPG3. The one person knows how to use it on an AS400, and they are not allowed to retire because who is going to work it? We can't find people that can do that skill set. But the real positives that come out of a digital transformation process that goes all the way from just modernizing networks and becoming more secure to a new ERP system, the most impactful ones are where they can now take advantage of these smart individuals and workers that have previously been just doing copying and pasting and super clerical work. What are you seeing, Eric?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question because I think maybe to back up even more, I agree with everything you just said, AV. I think the big challenge though that organizations have is that they don't think through that question. To define themselves, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with AV's job and Eric's job and Megan and Tyler? How are their jobs going to look different? What are their roles and responsibilities going to be? I think too often we give lip service, or we see organizations give lip service to potential benefits and call it good and say, for example, AV, guess what? We're going to roll out this new technology and it's going to automate 30% of your job. That instead of having to manually go look for information now or manually process a PO or whatever the case may be, now you've got software or technology that can automate that. And usually people position that benefit or that value as a positive to employees, but oftentimes that's going to get perceived more often than not as a negative. Because you haven't told me what am I going to do with that other 30% now. You're telling me you're going to automate it, but what are you going to do? Are you going to cut my pay? Are you going to cut my hours? Are you going to cut my job? Are you going to assign me other stuff that I have to learn and you haven't told me what it is yet, and so I'm scared? So it's all those sorts of things that go through people's minds because they haven't defined what the skills are they have today, what the skills are they need for the future, and then they don't have a deliberate plan to transition. So it doesn't directly answer the question of what we typically see, or if it's the skills gap being bigger than initially thought. I guess I would agree that yes, the skills gap is bigger than most organizations think, but more importantly, they don't even define what the gap is and how they're going to get there. I think that's the even more important question: is how are you going to close that gap, whether it's big or small or whatever.
Yeah, we also see that there's a lack of understanding of what automation will mean, right? If you were running paper-based processes in our world, it's purchase orders, right? You need a pencil, you need a process for purchase order, 3 different approvals, and I'm exaggerating, but when you go into government offices, organizations, and say we're going to redesign your process, where we map it, right? We use IBM BlueWorks Live, and we'll map a process with every decision box, every resourcing box, every action box, and a 20-step process turns into a 5-step process. And a lot of our clients don't understand. So if I'm not doing that copying of that spreadsheet and pasting it into this spreadsheet, who's doing it? Are you telling me that I'm not going to be doing that, so I'm out of a job? It's a process of educating them on what a modern system does. So a lot of times what we'll do is, before they even put an RFP out, we'll do like a market scan, an educational demo with a vendor that is non-committal from the client side, to say, here's what a modern 2023 ERP system does and how automated this is. And it just blows their minds because they haven't looked up from their green screen or their Excel sheet in 20 years.
Yeah, that's super interested in that fact. And I think it goes back to something that is a fundamental difference or another misunderstanding, specifically when it comes to the public sector digital transformation overall projects. You had mentioned before, AV, that sometimes vendors kind of create a copy and paste approach that in the those kind of canned types of timelines, those canned templates. We hate the word templates, we never say it. But when it comes to understanding specifically public sector businesses, are they all the same? Can you use that approach knowing that the same city and county of San Diego might be doing something that the city and county of Albany might be doing? Can you talk to us about that misconception?
It's I would say it's 80-90% similar. It's a city, like a city or a county exists to provide services to your citizens, right? Collect taxes, make sure the roads are okay. You have sheriffs or police officers that can communicate with each other. And then on the internal side, they need to make sure that the dollars they're spending are being recorded correctly, that there's audit controls, and there's proper reporting. That's the basic function of a public sector agency, is to provide services to their citizens. And what tends to happen is, if they don't have a long-term strategy, that's when you get these siloed systems and processes that don't necessarily connect to each other, and that's where they sort of lose the mission. And again, if you don't have a global vision of where you want to take your organization, which is again a commonality, right? When you deal with your clients, the basic simple thing: why are you trying to do this, and why are you trying to modernize your systems, and why a specific tool set versus another.
Absolutely. And what do you think about that, Eric? And we see that a lot kind of when it comes across industry, right? If you've worked in food and beverage, then you know everything about food and beverage.
Yeah, I guess this is an interesting thread that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about. But what it's maybe opening up to me a little bit here is that, in the private sector, I suppose it's quite a bit different, or there's a lot more variation, I would think, because whereas a city or local, state, federal entity has sort of its defined scope of what service it needs or should be providing to its stakeholders and constituents. Private sector is different in that there's no clearly defined scope. I mean, your strategy is constantly evolving. You're constantly trying to outdo the competition. You're trying to keep up with the industry and macroeconomic trends. All these different things that just influence maybe the private sector a bit more. And there's just more of an open road, I suppose you could say, as far as how they go about running their business. Whereas in the public sector, it's sort of not predefined, but you have a narrow scope. There's certain things that you just have to do, and AV just did a good job describing some of them. So I think that probably creates less of a case, or a less likelihood that you're going to have best practices or templates that could work off the shelf out of the box for any given scenario in the private sector. But I would think it's even challenging in the public sector, though. Even though what you're saying, AV, is I think you said 80-90% of processes are similar, and there's nuances and slight variations. But in those cases, are you seeing that you could still use, in many cases, like pre-configurations or industry best practices, or just sort of vanilla software? Do you think it's more likely that you can use that in the public sector than in the private sector?
I think so. And I think my team's doing a great job of educating our clients on that, because it's easy for a city, even the city we are headquartered in, the next door is a smaller city, and how different can two small cities in Tennessee be? But you talk to them and they're like, we're so unique. So New York and San Diego, the people that are operating these cities, it's a lot of pride, right? It's city pride, civic pride. So they don't want to be like San Diego. Nashville does not want to be like New York. So that plays into it a lot. But as consultants, our job is to tell them, all of that aside, you need to run your payables process. How different is it, right? And we're seeing that get a little better with time, because in the vendors take advantage of this too. Here in Tennessee, we have one vendor that's legacy, that sort of somehow has the blessing from the state, and everyone assumes that is a state provided system and therefore must be better than anything else out there. We've got a similar situation in Virginia, where they have a system that most cities use that isn't very good. But the perception is that because we're Virginia cities, this is the one to use. So a lot of it is perception. And I think the more we educate our clients and the more we help them understand that at a very basic level, the blueprints exist. Now, your state or county or comptroller's office may have certain restrictions and regulations on how things are classified or how things are reported back on. Those nuances need to be configured for, but for the most part, um, and again, public sector is large. There's different kinds of agencies, right? If we're just talking small city to small city, the majority of the processes tend to remain the same.
Absolutely, and I think and I know Megan, you definitely know about this question as well, and when it in the overall public trust. So kind of moving back to that hot topic, which is the FAA, which we'll go over in ground control next week, the entire kind of failure. Ghassan says that cybersecurity threats and data breaches in the public sector really determine public trust, which is ultimately the need to be able to secure funding, right, for these bigger projects. So what's your reaction to that, AV, when it comes to big failures that could be, that could determine the overall voting of your constituents, I would assume?
Yeah. Well, and loss of data is pretty real, right? We see a lot of cities and counties, they get hacked, data is held for ransomware, and in most cases it's older systems that have never been tested for backups, that have never been, they've just paid for things that, and we see this every day. They'll buy things that they are not implementing 100%. Not all the features are turned on. They just don't have the infrastructure to escape a cyber event in an efficient manner. So that sort of taints the whole thing. So when you start talking about hosted solutions and software as a service, and the cloud, the immediate reaction is how secure is it? And then we have to dig into how secure they are currently, because if the baseline's not there, no amount of um, cloud security and SIMs and network monitoring is going to help you, right? So it's prevalent in the public sector. They're getting better at it, but also they're going at it from a cyber insurance sort of standpoint, which is they're assuming they're going to get a cyber event, and now they're looking to shore that up through a cyber policy, which also opens another whole can of worms, because cyber insurance providers will cover you. They may not pay for your claim because you don't have all of your ducks in a row, and you haven't checked off everything that is not just technical, but from a management perspective, you don't have proper disaster recovery plans, incident response plans. You don't know who's in charge or who to call when a cyber event happens. So there's layer. I call it the cybersecurity layer cake. If you have one layer, is it still a cake? But you really need 7 layers to make it real. So cybersecurity is something that's critical in our clientele.
Yeah, and I think just to build off of what AV has said, sometimes, not all of the time, we do see a big disconnect between our executive leadership and our IT departments, right? Our executive leadership, sometimes they don't know what questions to ask, or how to communicate. Hey, are we cyber secure? Are we secure? And so I think helping them bridge that gap within the organization is key.
Absolutely, 100%. And love the food analogies. Definitely keep those coming because those are my personal. But in knowing that, and we have a lot of dialogue in the comments. So thank
Yeah.
you for continuing to do that. Just so we will go back through and answer all of those too if we don't get to your questions. And you're very right. Nashville and New York City are very culturally different. I think that's a big key takeaway is each city and county can be, each organization has its own subculture that's going to determine the overall success of that. So I want to go to Eric a little bit just to touch on the importance of that cybersecurity and that overall understanding of what those gaps in systems. We see a lot, and I'm not sure if you do, AV and Megan, but we see a lot of best of breed solutions. So a lot of those interoperabilities within an organization and the need to kind of close those doors to cybersecurity threats. So want Eric to be able to, comment on what you're seeing as far as those needs in our digital transformation projects.
Yeah, I think cybersecurity is a big deal, in both spaces. I think that's another commonality or area of commonality. I think the risk is a bit different, and the visibility might be different. I'm not sure, who the bigger targets are. Whether the bigger targets are in the public or private sector. I don't have a good answer for you there, but I think that in many ways, the private sector has more to lose in some ways, just because anyone's going to lose obviously if they have a cybersecurity issue or incident. But I would think that in the private sector, especially larger financial services companies or even retail or any organization that has consumer information, credit cards, things like that, there's just more at stake, I guess you'd say. And I suppose that's probably true in the public sector too. I might be oversimplifying, or maybe I'm painting a bigger contrast than there really is. But I think that's what private sector companies have to worry about, is just the risk of, if they have a breach, it's a big deal from a customer perspective, a customer trust perspective. It could affect their profitability. And so back to the earlier question of what drives digital transformation and business value in public versus private sector has a lot of profit to lose if they violate that trust. In public sector, it's maybe a different kind of a trust that's lost, or different negative business value that's realized from a cybersecurity breach.
Well, and they hold the same kind of information, right? If you're collecting taxes, or you're collecting money for your car tags or utility bills, especially, huge risk factor there to have that data exposed. So when we do digital transformation, it's also a great time to see who's holding what kind of data, right? The best practice, or at least what we profess, is that as you're bringing in new systems, be very careful and sure of who's holding your data. If you're in the cloud, if you're running through a third-party payment system, who's going to hold ultimately the banking information, the people's credit cards and social security numbers? And the smarter clients are pushing that risk off of them to the vendors, and the smarter vendors are saying, yeah, we'll carry it for you for an extra price. So it's all in the design, and again, rethinking how you're delivering services and what parts of this service should you be responsible for.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And if you missed it, we did talk to Brad Feeks a few weeks back when it comes to overall cloud security. So you can head over to our Ground Control podcast or our YouTube channel, be able to see that as well. One other thing I'll mention, just on the public sector, do have some additional content for our global audience as well when it's to additional transportation. We talked about British Airways last week on Ground Control. If you do have any examples of how globally you've seen public sector businesses go through a digital transformation, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. So kind of keep that coming. I have a question when it comes to public sector. What essentially would be your metrics for success? What is your ROI when it comes to achieving a successful digital transformation? Like you said, it's not really profit driven, if you will. So I'd love to hear kind of what your clients, what are they trying to achieve mostly, and how do you help them kind of hone into that and achieve that alignment around it?
Yeah, so great question. ROI is hard to define for our clients, because you're not going to suddenly collect more taxes because you might pick up on the ones that haven't paid in a long time and therefore collect more. But it really depends on how they define it, and they usually don't. So it goes back to, why are we doing this? What's the trigger event? And it can be as simple as the old thing broke and now we're back on, or more transparent, more automated. And if they ask us to, we'll define it for them. There's a lot of assumptions that get built into it, right? How much time did it cost you to create a purchase order in the past, and now how much time does it cost you with the new system? So for example, a client of ours that was using an AS400 green screen for their ERP, it would take them a week to 2 weeks to just go from I want to buy a box of pencils to the department director saying yes and sign offs, and they would send pieces of paper through interoffice mail to the other building so that someone else could sign it. And that process went down to about 1 hour, assuming everyone's at their desks or on their phones and paying attention. So how good is that for ROI, right? So we were able to, assign some dollar amounts to that, and just you don't have to be a whiz to understand that there is a return right there. So in our clientele, it tends to be stories like that. It tends to be assumptions on how much time it took to run a certain process in the past versus now. And it's really immeasurable, right? Because they're, again, very well-meaning, smart people that have been bogged down by a lack of modern technology, and they didn't know how to start thinking about this. And to see them do things in a more automated fashion after we've gone through this whole process of digital transformation is very satisfying to me. And I think that to us is internal ROI for Avèro. But also on our client side, it's a great story to tell when that person that was just running around with paperwork has now got time to like sit back and become more strategic and think about the future rather than just chasing Excel sheets all day.
Yeah, that's really well said, Eric. I don't know how you're going to follow that,
Yeah,
but yeah, that was.
I've got nothing.
You need a points counter. I need
I
to
know.
know how many points. Yeah.
Yeah, we're keeping
Yeah, that
score.
I'm here for points. Absolutely. And I think, that's something that certainly translates in our world for doing both public and private sector work. So Eric, how do you help a company define the measure for success when you're sitting down, you're talking about project strategy, and you're making sure that you have that alignment and commitment? How do you help businesses really kind of pull that and define it?
Well, I think in some ways it's easier for the private sector for a lot of the reasons that AV just mentioned. I mean, there's not a, and we talked about this earlier too. There's not a traditional ROI calculation that you might do in the public sector, or at least it's going to be harder to do because how do you, you can quantify a lot of what AV just said. It's difficult, but you could quantify, the efficiency gains and what do you gain from having someone streamline their process. What do you gain from employee morale being higher potentially because they've got better tools. They're not frustrated, trying to fight an uphill battle against their technology. And someone in the somewhere in the comments here, someone mentioned that staff turnover is a good measure. That was one of the comments from LinkedIn here, and I think that's something you could point to and say, that's a positive ROI if we can decrease attrition and employee satisfaction is higher. There's some value there. In the private sector, though, I think it's even more important because in the private sector, in my opinion, you have no excuse not to figure out what the ROI is because you are profit driven, you are driven by cash flow, and that's your, as an organization, that's generally the top, the top priority. Whereas public sector is a little bit more complex. Their goal is not to maximize profit. That's just not what they do. And so private sector, if you can't calculate an ROI or you don't focus on ROI, I'd say you're not doing your job. I think you need to be looking at what the ROI is. Yes, there's certain business value, business drivers that are harder to quantify than others. Some you can't quantify. But if your only reason for going through a transformation is because you have to replace your technology and because SAP or Oracle or Microsoft or whoever told you have to get off an old legacy system, that's not a good enough reason. That might be the reason you're doing it. That might be the impetus, but you still have to define where the expected business value is, not just to justify the project, but just to give you sort of that guiding North Star of how you're going to manage the project and what is it we're trying to accomplish with this transformation beyond just replacing technology. So I think ROI is super important in the private sector for sure.
Absolutely, definitely. Well, I know we have just a few minutes left with the team here, so just want to get to a few additional questions. And just a reminder, if you put your questions in the comments, we always go back and answer all of the questions. So I want to get to this one because this is really interesting. And I'm so sorry, I can't see your name. It just says LinkedIn user. But specific public sector, almost all organizations have a risk management division or department. Yet, more often than not, they're not involved in transformation efforts. The whole concept of, quote, compliant by design is completely foreign to them. I know when risk management is involved, it reduces costs of poor quality, thus reworking the design. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this specifically, and maybe even digging into the factor of compliance, right? That I assume that's a big thing in your world as it is in the private sector. But I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on that. So let's go to AV first on that.
Sure. Yeah, risk management is an important function within our clients. They, when we do our contracting, it's such a long process, and this one Eric can get a point on because um, our contracting takes a long time. But risk management is involved because they want to make sure we have the right insurances and things like that, so that the county or the city is compliant. On projects, uh, they tend to be not involved as much, but you're right, they should be, because when you're selecting a vendor that's cloud-based, how do you make sure that they're compliant with your organizational practices, with your expectations for cybersecurity and risk management? And they tend to reduce the risk of bad quality for sure. But in my experience, in our clientele, they are very focused on just the insurance and bonding requirements, and they haven't evolved to the point where they're asking the real critical questions of a software vendors from a risk management perspective. But I think it's getting there slowly. Eric?
Yeah, I think risk management is more important with publicly traded and larger private sector enterprises, I would say. And so that's a big risk management's a big deal for them, partly because there's compliance issues, but also partly because they just have more at stake and they're usually more sophisticated and mature in their ability to manage risk. But I think there's a lot of lessons that the mid market and even smaller private sector organizations could learn from the public sector and from larger private sector enterprises in terms of risk management. And back to the ROI question, one of the equations of ROI is obviously cost, and if you can mitigate cost and risk during your deployment and after your transformation, that's certainly going to deliver an ROI in terms of lower cost and reducing that risk of having the project plan and the budget get out of control.
Yeah, and I
Absolutely.
just want to comment on, sorry, Kyler, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just want to comment a little bit on the RFP solicitation. So part of my job is to look for RFPs for Avèro to respond to. And I think, just to make a brief comment, I think sometimes they can be too compliant, right? And so our public sector clients, they limit themselves to what kind of business they can actually do because they haven't revamped that compliance process. So,
Good
yeah,
point.
that's an excellent point. Really, really good point, for sure. And we all know that the most expensive part of a digital transformation is the re's. Right? We took that from Tim Creasy over at ProSci. That's redo, redesign, restructure. And that's a lot of times where we're coming into implementations that have failed or on the yellow path to fail. So definitely so important to have that information solidified and up front. So as we kind of round out, I always like to ask Eric this question, AV, so I'm going to ask it to you and see if you answer the same to him. So no pressure whatsoever. If you're sitting in a room with a client, that's getting ready to go through a digital transformation or contemplating what that's going to look like for their public sector business, what is the number one piece of advice that you typically give to them in knowing that this is going to be a long, arduous process? What's the kind of the one thing that you would say, do this if nothing else?
Make decisions. Like if I'm talking to the sponsor, who tends to be, on a financial ERP implementation, typically a CFO, make decisions. Don't be afraid to make decisions, because there will be times, especially with our government clients, which everyone is, right? They make decisions by committee. So if there was one thing I would say, be a strong man, at least or woman, for the next year and a half, so that we can get this thing going and moving along.
Very good. Very good answer. What about you, Eric?
Well, I think just building on that, I think the alignment, not only making decisions, but then getting the team aligned. Because I would think in the public sector, you're less likely, and first of all, you're highly unlikely in any organization to get a unanimous agreement on major decisions that need to happen.
Mhm.
But I would think in the public sector, perhaps, I'd be curious to see what you think, AV, but I would think in the public sector, you're even less likely to get total alignment and total clarity of direction, partly
Yeah.
because of, elected officials, the internal politics
Mhm.
and the things we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And partly because there isn't the clear profit motive that most private sector organizations have. So I think that that in some ways helps in terms of creating that alignment. But even in the private sector, it is difficult. The larger the organization is, and the more stakeholders you have, the more employees you have, the harder it is to get everyone on the same
Mhm.
page. So I think that's really key too, is just really sort of greasing the wheels with
Yeah.
not only good, solid decision making, but also once those decisions are made, making sure that you've got clarity and direction, and so you're all aligned, heading in the same direction.
Yeah,
Yeah,
one
and
of the things
there's a sorry,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Evie, sorry. I was
Um,
I was just going to say, one of the things I hear AV say all the time when we're in the room with the client is um, make sure you have a clear vision, right? What is it that you want as the executive leader or the leader of this project? What is it? What do you want out of it? And I think knowing that from the top down and communicating that to your employees is key as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
alignment is key because, there's also a perception in our world that the rank and file workers will outlast the elected officials and therefore the appointed directors. So there's incentive and really no repercussion in slow rolling it. So setting the vision and making sure that, because you can't fire people easily, there is no profit motive. This is now a case study in how do you motivate people to do something really difficult that doesn't impact their personal bottom line um, immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you motivate people in that very easy to answer one sentence question? But it seems as though that's a necessity, right? For this type of thing. It's going to be the only reason in which the project is going to be successful. So what are some tactics that specifically in thinking through as a public sector business that you can do to create that motivation or that internal buy-in?
I think that's when we put on our therapist and Tony Robbins hats, right? And understand what motivates people and find those leaders at every level that will take this on for you for a more esoteric reason, that they want to, being in public sector, they're making a choice to, in many cases, make less money than they would on the outside. So there is that strong public service sentiment that we tap into and help people align themselves with the project. If someone's about to retire and they've been like, why are we doing this now? I'm leaving in 2 years. Could you not have waited? We can then roll this into their legacy as, before you retire, don't you want to leave this place in a better place? If it's a new employee that has just come into the workforce, this is your chance to make this place better. Do you want to keep working on an AS400 for 30 years? No. So let's do this. So there's a lot of nuance, and our team's pretty good at the motivational part. As consultants, this is probably a similarity. We are practitioners of a very specific craft, but also we have to be good therapists without being licensed for it and without being clinically good at it. We have to be therapists at a very basic level because this is hard. This is hard stuff.
It is.
Absolutely.
That
And
understanding is so
yeah.
important too. That listening and
Yep.
understanding where people
Mhm.
are and where they're going and where the pains are. I think that's a great point and well said.
Yes, we often refer to our change management practitioners as industrial psychologists because that's really what they have to do, right? That's absolutely key. And what I'm hearing is that we're going to need to do a second session with Eric and AV and Megan about the influence of organizational change and overall industrial psychology in public versus private sector. So we certainly, we're all voting and we vote for a here. But so we so appreciate you joining us today and sharing your insights. So Megan, where can we learn more about Avèro, or how can we get to know you guys a little bit better?
Yeah, absolutely. By following myself, Megan Seaton, or AV on LinkedIn. We also have an Avèro Advisors LinkedIn page. Please visit our website, averoadvisors.com. We have links to our YouTube channel there. A lot of great videos, a lot of great storytelling, client stories. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for joining us today. And we will tag AV and Min and our partners here in the comments, so you're able to easily connect with them. But definitely recommend following their thought leadership and continued dialogue in this space. So as a reminder, this live stream will now be absorbed into our Transformation Ground Control podcast. We have 2 podcasts here at Third Stage. We have one that drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, which is our Digital Stratosphere short form podcast. And then we have our longer form podcast that covers industry trends and then features thought leaders like AV and Megan in our space. So head over to our website. You can subscribe to those. We also live stream them on Wednesday mornings. So you can join me and team in chatting with us. We stream the podcast on wherever you get your podcasts. So thank you so much to Eric, AV, and Megan for joining us today, and we will see you next week.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you
This
all.
is great.
Yep. Thank you, guys.